The cameras were already rolling when it happened. A packed Senate chamber, blazing lights, and a silence so heavy you could almost hear the heartbeat of every person in the room. Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh sat under those lights, adjusting his tie, expecting another dull round of oversight questions. Nothing unusual until a freshman congresswoman walked in carrying a thin blue folder. At first, no one noticed, but Kavanaugh did. His eyes locked onto it like he already knew what was inside. Within minutes, that single folder would trigger a reaction never before seen from a sitting Supreme Court justice on live television. Millions watched as the unthinkable unfolded. An unshakable judge suddenly looked shaken. His hand trembled as he reached for his water glass. The cameras zoomed in. The headlines were already writing themselves. But what exactly was in that folder? And how did a first-term lawmaker manage to rattle one of the most powerful men in America? This is the story of the hearing that shook the Supreme Court, the moment when one congresswoman pulled back the curtain on what may be the most controversial secret in modern judicial history. At first, nothing about the hearing seemed unusual. It was supposed to be another long day of political speeches, polite questions, and carefully rehearsed answers. The kind of government routine that most people only half watch on C-SPAN before switching the channel. Justice Brett Kavanaugh had been through this before. Years had passed since his fiery confirmation hearings, and he'd settled comfortably into his role as one of the Supreme Court's most reliable conservative voices. He'd learned to avoid controversy, to stay quiet, and to let his written opinions do the talking. Today was supposed to be just another performance of that control. Then came Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a newcomer from Texas, barely a year into her first term. She didn't look like someone who could shake the foundations of the Supreme Court, but behind her calm expression was a legal mind sharpened by years. As a civil rights attorney, someone who'd spent her career exposing contradictions others preferred to hide. As she took her seat, the chatter in the room faded. She didn't grandstand. She didn't smile for the cameras. She simply placed that slim blue folder on the desk in front of her and waited for her turn. To most people watching, it was just a folder. But to Kavanaugh, it was a warning flare. His composure cracked just slightly, but enough for the trained eye to see. The justice, who prided himself on control, suddenly looked uneasy. He didn't know what she had or how she got it, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever was in that folder, it wasn't supposed to see the light of day. And when the chair recognized Representative Crockett for her 15 minutes of questioning, that calm, orderly hearing began to feel like the quiet before a storm that no one in the room was ready for. When her turn finally came, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't waste a second. She leaned forward, microphone live, voice steady. "Justice Kavanaugh," she began, "thank you for being here today. I'd like to talk about judicial transparency." Nothing unusual in those first few words. The justice nodded, offering his practiced, polite smile. But then Crockett did something subtle, something every attorney watching instantly recognized. She reached for the blue folder. The movement was slow, deliberate. She didn't even open it right away. Just the sight of it on the desk shifted the energy in the room. Kavanaugh's eyes flicked toward it once, then again. Viewers at home noticed. Commentators would later freeze frame that exact moment, the instant his confidence faltered. Inside that folder was something no Supreme Court justice ever wanted to see broadcast to the world. A confidential memorandum, handwritten notes, and evidence suggesting that what Kavanaugh had sworn to Congress years earlier didn't match what he had written behind closed doors. Crockett continued calmly, almost conversationally. "During your confirmation hearing," she said, "you assured this committee that you respected precedent, that Roe v. Wade was, in your own words, settled law. Would you say your record has remained consistent with that statement?" Kavanaugh took a sip of water. "Congresswoman, I believe my record speaks for itself," he said, his voice slightly tighter than before. And that's when Crockett opened the folder. The camera caught every detail. The crisp sound of paper, Kavanaugh's eyes narrowing, the faint tremor in his hand. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "this will help refresh your memory." In that moment, the air seemed to leave the room. The justice looked stunned. Staffers leaned in. The chair's gavel hovered, uncertain. And as Crockett began to read from that document, millions of Americans watching live realized they weren't just witnessing another political skirmish. They were watching the beginning of a crisis that would shake the very foundations of the Supreme Court. What most people watching that hearing didn't realize was that the real story had started weeks earlier, long before the cameras, long before the confrontation. It began with a quiet message sent from inside one of the most secretive institutions in America, the Supreme Court. A whistleblower, a name unknown then, a shadow in the background, had reached out to Congresswoman Crockett's staff. The message was short but explosive. It claimed there were internal court documents authored by Justice Brett Kavanaugh himself that directly contradicted the sworn statements he made during his confirmation hearings. At first, it sounded impossible. The Supreme Court isn't just secretive, it's sealed tight. Law clerks, aides, even other justices guard internal communications like classified material. Leaks from the court are almost unheard of. But the documents were real. Crockett's legal team spent days verifying their authenticity, cross-checking signatures, timestamps, and even the metadata embedded in the files. Every test came back clean. This wasn't rumor or political spin, it was evidence. Now she faced a decision that could define her entire career. If she confronted a Supreme Court justice with these documents in public, and they turned out to be fake, her credibility would be destroyed overnight. But if they were real, the consequences could shake the foundation of the highest court in the nation. For days, Crockett wrestled with the choice. Her staff warned her of the backlash. Allies urged her to go through proper channels. But her background as a civil rights attorney had taught her something most politicians forget: that truth means nothing if it stays hidden. So she made her decision. She would bring the truth to light, live under oath in front of the American people. And when she placed that blue folder on the desk, it wasn't just evidence she carried, it was a challenge to one of the most powerful institutions in the world. Because if those memos were genuine, they wouldn't just expose one man's contradiction. They would reveal that even the Supreme Court, the very symbol of American justice, might not be immune to deception. When the moment finally came, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The precision in her tone was sharper than any shout. "Justice Kavanaugh," she said evenly, 2 years before the Dobbs decision, you circulated an internal memo referring to Roe v. Wade as, and I quote, "a constitutional error we finally have the votes to correct." Do you recall writing that? The words landed like a thunderclap. Kavanaugh blinked, his expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and alarm. For a few seconds he said nothing. Then with visible effort he leaned toward the microphone. "I'm not familiar with any such memo," he replied, his voice just a little too careful. Crockett nodded, calm as ever. "Perhaps this will refresh your recollection." She lifted a single page from the blue folder. The camera zoomed in close enough for viewers to see the Supreme Court letterhead, the date, and the signature at the bottom. Brett M. Kavanaugh. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Even the committee chair looked stunned, glancing between the document and the justice. "Mr. Chairman," a Republican member objected, "this is an ambush. These documents are confidential." But Crockett was ready. "Confidential doesn't mean untouchable," she said firmly. "When the public's right to the truth collides with secrecy, transparency must win." Kavanaugh shifted in his seat, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for his water glass. The once unflappable justice now looked cornered, his legal training fighting to stay ahead of the moment unraveling before him. "Justice Kavanaugh," she continued, reading again, "you wrote, 'We should maintain public ambiguity about our intentions until the right case presents itself.' Would you like to explain that statement to this committee?" The room fell silent. The question was surgical, precise, devastating, and impossible to dodge. "I can't comment on internal deliberations," Kavanaugh finally said, each word measured. Crockett didn't flinch. "This isn't about deliberation," she replied. "This is about honesty. You swore under oath that Roe was settled law, yet here, in your own handwriting, you describe a strategy to overturn it. Those two things can't both be true." Gasps rippled through the room. The chairman's gavel came down hard. But the damage was already done. Every camera in that chamber was locked on Kavanaugh, his face pale, his eyes downcast, his silence speaking louder than any denial. Outside the hearing, millions of Americans were already reacting in real time. The clip hit social media before the gavel even echoed. And within minutes, The world had seen what few ever imagined possible. A Supreme Court justice visibly shaken, caught between his words and his record. The second Crockett's final words hit the microphone, the room erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions, aides scrambled, and the chairman's gavel hammered uselessly against the noise. But the damage was already done. By the time Justice Kavanaugh left the chamber, the clip had already gone viral. Within minutes, every major network had broken into live coverage. Cable news switched graphics. Social media feeds flooded with a single phrase, the blue folder. On Twitter, hashtags exploded: Kavanaugh memos, judicial crisis, blue folder truth. Clips of the hearing looped endlessly, slowed down, zoomed in, analyzed frame by frame. His trembling hand, the tightening jaw, the visible panic. Body language experts were brought onto talk shows to interpret every twitch and blink. One commentator said, "You can fake words, but you can't fake fear." News anchors spoke in the kind of tones reserved for national emergencies. CNN's banner read, "Shock in the Senate. Leaked memos rock Supreme Court." Fox News countered with, "Political ambush or historic accountability." And by nightfall, the New York Times headline summed it up. Supreme contradiction. Private memos versus public testimony. Legal scholars filled every studio seat, dissecting what they'd just seen. Some called it a defining moment for judicial oversight. Others called it an institutional nightmare. The White House issued a careful, lawyerly statement. The president believes in the integrity of both the judiciary and congressional oversight. These are serious allegations that deserve full investigation. Translation? They were worried, and with good reason. The Supreme Court had always been the one branch of government that stood above the political storm. But this was different. A sitting justice accused of misleading Congress under oath, confronted live on television with his own words. It was the kind of constitutional drama America had never seen before. And the public could feel it. Polls shifted overnight. Late-night hosts turned the hearing into breaking news monologues. Protesters gathered outside the Supreme Court before sunrise, holding signs that read, "Who judges the judges?" Meanwhile, in Kavanaugh's chambers, the mood was far from calm. Insiders described late-night phone calls, emergency strategy meetings, and private discussions with Chief Justice Roberts that reportedly did not go well. Crockett, on the other hand, had become an overnight phenomenon. To her supporters, she was the face of courage, the lawmaker who dared to question power. To her critics, she was reckless, a political showboat who'd weaponized leaks for attention. But love her or hate her, no one could deny what she'd done. She'd forced the country to look directly at the institution it trusted most, and to ask whether justice itself could ever be truly impartial. And as the story spread, one question began to echo through every newsroom, every courtroom, and every living room in America. If this is what we just saw on camera, what's happening behind closed doors? Within hours of the broadcast, the shockwaves reached every corner of Washington. Inside the highest court in the nation, the marble halls that once felt untouchable now buzzed with whispers. Clerks deleted emails, aides avoided eye contact, and security protocols tightened overnight. The justices, once united by silent tradition, now met behind closed doors, not to discuss cases but damage control. The leak had shattered something deeper than secrecy. It cracked the illusion that the court stood above politics. And once that illusion breaks, it's almost impossible to repair. In the West Wing, the phones wouldn't stop ringing. Senators demanded statements. The Attorney General requested briefings. Even the President's legal counsel was said to have asked one haunting question: if a justice lies under oath, who judges the judge? Meanwhile, across the country, faith in the system began to crumble. Talk radio hosts called it the end of judicial innocence. Law professors called it an institutional earthquake. And for millions of citizens watching from home, the message was clear: no one, not even the highest court, was beyond scrutiny. Protests formed outside courthouses nationwide. Some carried signs that read, "Truth over tradition." Others, "No justice without accountability." It wasn't just anger, it was disbelief. The kind that comes when the pillars you've trusted your whole life suddenly start to shake. Back inside the court, the pressure was unbearable. Rumors swirled of internal investigations, of a justice considering resignation, of alliances breaking down. Every whispered conversation could be the start of a scandal. Every silence felt like guilt. And at the heart of it all was that one haunting symbol, the blue folder. It had become more than evidence. It was a metaphor for everything Americans suspected but could never prove. That behind the robes, the marble, and the Latin inscriptions, there were cracks. The court's spokesperson tried to project calm, calling the situation under review. But even that phrase, sterile bureaucratic, couldn't hide the truth. Something irreversible had happened. Trust had broken. And once trust is gone, even the oldest institutions begin to tremble. As one veteran journalist put it that night on air, this isn't just a scandal. This is a stress test on the Constitution itself. For weeks, the world speculated. Who leaked the documents? How did something so deeply buried inside the court make its way into the hands of a first-term congresswoman? Journalists chased leads that went nowhere. Anonymous tips poured in, some pointing to clerks, others to disgruntled aides, even retired judges. But no one knew the truth. Not until a quiet email arrived in the inbox of an independent journalist who'd been covering the story from the start. The subject line read, "You're looking in the wrong place." The sender was untraceable, no name, no signature, just a single attachment. It wasn't a document this time, but an audio file. The voice was disguised, distorted. But what it said would ignite an entirely new chapter in the scandal. I never wanted this to happen. But I watched decisions being made that weren't about law, they were about power. I saw promises broken and truth buried. And I realized that silence was complicity. The voice paused. Then softer. The memo wasn't the only thing they're hiding. Within hours, the recording spread online. Every news outlet wanted to authenticate it, but experts couldn't agree. Some claimed it was genuine, a real insider risking everything to expose corruption. Others argued it was a deep fake, a deliberate distraction planted to shift the blame. But one thing was undeniable. Whoever the whistleblower was, they understood the inner workings of the court in ways no outsider could. The details they described, from case conferences to draft circulation schedules, were too precise to fake. For the first time, even the justices themselves couldn't tell who to trust. Every staff member was questioned. Security protocols were rewritten. And in the middle of the panic, someone inside the court made a chilling discovery. The leak had come from a system that only 6 people had access to. That narrowed the list, but it also meant something even worse. If the whistleblower was who the clues suggested, then this wasn't just an act of conscience. It was an act of rebellion from within. And as the recording's final line echoed across the internet, it became the spark for a new wave of outrage, not just about one justice or one decision, but about the entire idea of unchecked power. "You think this is over?" the voice said. "It's only just beginning." In the months that followed, everything changed. The hearings were over, but their echo lingered. The blue folder became a symbol not just of one man's secrets, but of an entire system forced to confront its reflection. Laws were proposed, investigations launched, and trust would take years to rebuild. The whistleblower was never identified. Some claimed they'd vanished overseas. Others believed they were still inside the system, quietly watching, waiting. Whoever they were, their actions had pulled back the curtain on an institution long believed to be untouchable. And in that revelation, in that shattering of illusion, the country found itself split in two. Some saw it as justice finally fighting back against corruption. Others saw it as an attack on the last sacred pillar of democracy. But beneath the outrage, the politics, and the headlines, one truth remained. Once you expose what's hidden, you can never put it back. Even years later, scholars and journalists would debate what really happened inside those marble walls. Was it betrayal or redemption? Did the system break apart, or did it finally wake up? History would decide that part. But one thing became clear to everyone who watched that fateful hearing, who saw the calm crack and the storm break wide open. Truth isn't always clean, and justice isn't always blind. Sometimes it takes chaos to reveal what's been hiding in plain sight. And somewhere out there, the whistleblower's words still echo, a quiet warning to anyone who believes power makes them untouchable. Secrets don't stay buried forever. Not when someone's willing to dig.